So this afternoon, what I'd like to do, apart from keep you awake, is go through two considerations. Firstly, because all of your students that are in the distance programs are based in workplaces, and they will be learning a lot in those workplaces. So I want to sort of consider, firstly, models of continuing education and training, and also a consideration of how that learning can occur in the workplace. And then after the afternoon break, I want to talk about the ways in which we can extend work-integrated education to include innovations in the workplace. So I'll be talking about innovations in the workplace, but also presenting 3 case studies, 1 from Sweden and 2 from Australia, about the way that work-integrated education programs have reached into workplaces with a specific focus on innovation. So that's the plan. And with your students, really, I mean, the adults who are situated in workplaces, as you've indicated, a lot of them are really in continuing education and training. Sometimes it's called professional development, sometimes it's called continuing professional development, but it's often referred to as continuing education and training. So there's a range of models that can occur within, and I'm just going to very briefly talk a little bit about one of those approaches. And yeah, it's this handout here. I'm just going to speak to it very briefly and leave it with you. So this was a research project undertaken in Singapore. Now Singapore, I don't know how many of you visited. Who's visited Singapore? Yeah, okay. As you know, it's a very small, in Australian terms, it's less than a handkerchief, It's a tiny place, and they've almost got 6 million people. What they haven't got is, like Australia has coal mines and minerals. Singapore doesn't have that. It's not even able to grow its own food, so it has to import the vast, vast majority of its food. So the key quality that Singapore has, what it relies its economy on, is its people, its workforce. So they give a lot of attention to education in Singapore, and they're giving a lot of attention to the continuing education and training of working age adults. And Singapore has the 3rd highest aged population. It goes Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and then racing up very quickly is China, because China has not only an aging population, but a massive aging population. But the consideration in Singapore is, how can we continue to sustain the employability of the adult workforce? And in 2010, they had an economic review, and this was done by economists. We've got some in the room, I believe. Now, generally speaking, economists aren't normally into things like education. They're into sort of models of economic stuff. But what came out of the economic review was that the key priority for Singapore was continuing education and training of the adult population, because it was so essential to its future. So there's a project that I was involved in, which was engaging in trying to understand how best that could be achieved through the polytechnics in Singapore. There's 5 polytechnics, and then there's one college called the Institute of Technical Education, ITE. And what we did in this project was we interviewed 180 adults who had completed their CET courses to identify what was effective and how it could be improved. And then we did a survey of working age Singaporeans to see whether the findings from interviewing 180 people were relevant across the broader Singaporean population. And then COVID came along. Okay. So COVID hit, which meant that in Singapore it was called the circuit breaker. So everybody was living and working from home. And Singaporean people are very rule observant. So when the government says you have to stay home and you have to wear face masks, they stayed home and then they wore face masks. They're very observant, they do that. But one thing that happened was during the circuit breakers, people had to continue to work and to communicate. And so people started using quite extensively, first of all, I think it was Skype, and then that quickly went out of vogue, and then it was Teams. No, what was before Teams? Zoom. And then people began using Teams, and then all the institutes began getting people working on Teams. Now, what I realized was towards the end of the circuit breaker, in fact, at the end of the circuit breaker, that a lot of adults were using Teams to engage in education, online education. And the institutions had converted their face-to-face programs onto online provisions. So I ran a separate survey at the end of the lockdown to see whether attitudes towards online education had changed. And because I had these 180 people interviewed, and then 700 people that we had surveyed. And so we sent out a second supplementary survey, and from that we got a reasonable response. And the survey focused on two things. Firstly, accessibility. Was working online, education online, more accessible? And secondly, was it more effective? Now, the point was that I had the data from the first round of interviews, so I actually had a pre and post test, so I could make judgments before COVID, BC, before COVID, and then AC, after COVID. And what was fascinating was that in terms of accessibility, there was a significant change in the attitude of working-age Singaporeans about the use of online technologies for their education. Significant change. They, in some sense, had been forced to use it, and once they'd been forced to use it, they found it to be far more accessible. And by the way, we'd gathered data about how long these people were spending their time before COVID going to Polytechnic. And in Singapore, the working day is fairly long. People work from, say, 9 till 6. And there is still the sort of idea that you shouldn't really leave before your boss leaves. So there's still that. And so we asked people how long were they spending travelling from work to the Polytechnic and then Polytechnic home. And it averaged out 45 minutes. So these people were doing a long day's work, then going to the Polytechnic, 45 minutes, 3 hours, somebody hitting them with 1,000 PowerPoints, and then going home, and then next day having to go to work. So it's perhaps not surprising then that they said that the online provision was far more accessible. There were some reservations. In terms of their effectiveness, what they were saying was that it was effective. But they came up with, it's interesting, they came up with options about how it could be more effective. And so they were saying things like initially you might have a face-to-face meeting, then you might do the course by distance, and then you might have a face-to-face meeting at the end of the course. In some sense, that was a response to some of the criticisms they had about the teaching of their CET programs, which was, as I was saying, 3 hours of being spoken to. And what they wanted to do was engage, they wanted to share their stories, blah-de-blah-de-blah. So I thought that was interesting. So in this brochure here, there's a lot of data. I won't dwell on that. But the simple point is that when you ask these people about the kind of model that they want, they're able to provide advice about what was effective, what was accessible. And so that's this was a bulletin that was used for workshops when we were testing out the ideas behind it. But I'd like just to go through some of these ideas about learning through work, because your students are fully engaged in working life and they'll be learning a lot through those experiences. In doing this, I'll be referring shortly to this brochure here, And this was a bulletin that came from a study that I undertook, a 4-year study of learning through work, which was funded by the Australian Research Council, and it built upon the earlier work I was doing, and I'll be referring to that shortly. But I'll quickly go through some ideas about learning through work. And what I think we know is there's 4 key contributions from people engaging and learning through work. The first one is you actually engaged in work activities. And when you ask workers, they often say, just doing it. You know, by doing something, you're learning from that. And what we know is that that is when we engage in a goal-directed activity, as I was talking earlier, when we engage in a goal-directed activity, change occurs in what we know, can do, and value. So changes arise through that. And when we do things that we've done before, we refine and hone what we know, can do, and value. And then when we do things we haven't done before, as long as they're not so difficult that it's not making sense, what that does, that extends what we know, can do, and value. And that really relates as much to what happens in education institutions as workplaces. So this would come from asking workers of different kinds about how they learn through work. By the way, some of my first studies was in the coal industry, in the coal mining industry in central Queensland. And in Australia, we have these men who we call blokey blokes, right? So blokey blokes are very masculine males. And they're not known for their oral skills. And I would ask them, how do you learn through work? And they would say, just doing it. And the earnest researcher would then say, yes, sir, but what do you mean by just doing it? So they then say, just doing it. And I would say, could you elaborate on that? And they'd say, just doing it, mate. Okay, so that's the point at which you need to move into deduction, all right? And so what they're really saying is that they're engaging in goal-directed activities from which they learn. Now, by the way, I'm not having a go at coal miners, because they're great people, but their education and their background hasn't led them to have the kind of vocabulary which allows them to articulate what they, how they're learning. For instance, when I interview doctors, medical doctors, these are people who are used to articulating their ideas. And when I interview doctors or medical specialists, the data I get from them is chocolate. It's wonderful. It's very rich data because they're used to doing this sort of stuff. Anyway, that's the first one. I digress, as usual. The second one is that workers say that they learn by just being there, that they observe what's going on and they learn through looking, observing and listening to what other people are doing. And we know that this is a very powerful form of learning. It's called mimetic learning, observation, imitation, and practice. And that covers 2 of those, observation and imitation. This is how humans have learned across our history. The third one is the opportunity to practice, to actually do something more than once. I might have told you that when I was a teacher in vocational education, I would teach students how to make this collar or this placket here. The students would just do one of them, and they'd have a little plastic envelope. They would put it in the plastic envelope. When what they needed to do was 20 of them to be good at it. Because I don't know if you know, but you see the point of the collar here? How do you think you sew that point of the collar? How do you think you do that? Do you think you sew like that into a corner? No. If you do that, when you turn it through, you get a big round lump. In the trade, it's called dog's balls. Okay? So what you do is you sew up, and then you have 2 stitches across. So it's like, then when you turn it through, it forms the point. But of course, that requires skill and control. So it's important then that people learning how to do that have practice, you do it multiple times to get the skill correct. And then the fourth thing that people report frequently is of close guidance, of being guided by somebody who knows more than them, can assist them develop that knowledge. Now it's interesting if you look at that list, and it took me a long time to make sense of this, you'll see that the first three are largely the product of the learner. And it's only the last one which is really the product of engaging with somebody who knows more than you. So the key premise there is that learning in the work setting is very much premised upon how the person comes to engage. And it's only that last one, the fourth one then, that is more dependent on engaging with another person. Hence, I was asked by a colleague over here about this concept of agentic learner. And that is the idea that the learner has to be active to actually construct knowledge. But I think it's very important that we realize that workplaces are not havens for learning. They're not, El Dorado, that they can be very problematic places for learning. I'm not trying to suggest for a moment, just like education institutions has its problems, learning in work settings has its limitations. Some of those limitations is that people can learn bad stuff. You can learn inappropriate processes. You can learn dangerous shortcuts, which are not helpful. There's often great difficulty getting to the activities that you want to engage in to learn.
The benefits for students engaging in work-integrated learning, the literature is very strong on this one. There's been a lot of work done around the benefits that it affords to students. Career clarification is one of them, and we just had the example of our forensic chemist who did not want to be a forensic chemist. It's good that he discovered that early on. Most of the time, I should say, students go on work placement and they absolutely love the experience, and it becomes a big motivator for them to carry on with the studies. And we've done a study that is showing that students who do work placements, in the context of science and technology, it motivates them to carry on to do graduate studies because they identify that the types of roles that they would want in the workplace, that often they are graduates of a master's program rather than the bachelor's one. So it becomes a motivator for graduate studies as well. It develops our capitals, our social capital, human capitals, cultural capitals. The networking that students do during work placements are particularly powerful and then enabling future employment. It helps them apply taught knowledge to relevant knowledge, and Stephen talked about that at length around that. And having a taught knowledge seen in practice and enacted in practice is really great at embedding that knowledge into the student. It gives insights to professional behavior, professional ethics, and also moral citizenship. And these things are really difficult, I should say, both in a good way and a bad way. They see bad behavior in the workplace too. But these concepts are quite difficult to teach because that's best done through observation and learning. There was a study done some years ago, and it was in the engineering space, that found that if you taught ethics to engineering students, it had a detrimental impact to them because they became cynical about ethics, which is the exact opposite of what we want. So there are some real challenges about teaching ethics, but I won't unpack that further because the study was a bit controversial as well. And of course, again, employability outcomes is the big benefit that comes through from engaging in work-integrated learning. Student preparation is particularly important. And as I mentioned earlier on, in the classical traditional models of work-integrated learning, we talk about preparation for the workplace. I think the challenge for you guys here is that how well are students prepared for learning? Learning through reflection, how to engage with the learning assignments. From what I gather, there are challenges around access to support because they're in remote regions, to be able to work as peers when they are isolated in different areas. So we need to look carefully around student preparation and student support. And again, you need to have feedback around this. We also need to consider both the supervisor and the mentor quality. And what I mean here is the academic supervisor and then the workplace supervisor. Now, we often make assumptions that these individuals are very good at supervising and mentoring, but that's an assumption that is often misplaced. particularly within the workplace where you can have quite a variation of experiences that supervisors will have. Someone will be great mentors, and they would have mentored before time and time again. Maybe they're a graduate from the program and can relate to that. But then there'll be others that are not, and they need support around that. And I would strongly encourage like a handbook around mentoring, as a mentoring style or supervising that you can share with those individuals. I know workplaces often use students in the workplace as an opportunity for a worker, for a person to practice becoming a supervisor. So that's their first go at supervising an individual, which is great for the workplace, by the way. I think that's good, but it does mean there's a bit of risk sitting in there as well. Assessment design, time and time again, assessment design comes up as being a significant issue and a significant challenge. And it is challenging, there's no doubt about that. Particularly when students are engaging in assessment and including assignments, when they're not physically on campus, that they're located elsewhere. It's important that we have assessment design that matches what the students are doing in the workplace. So authentic learning and authentic assessment is the terms that you want to be looking up around that. There are a lot of good examples around good assessment design for work integrated learning. Don't often see them in the literature though. You might see them in handbooks or books itself, but as journal articles, not so much because we don't tend to publish best practice examples. So it's good to engage with other people who are active in a different institution and borrow ideas. And I've got examples later on that will hopefully help some of the thinking around assessment design and how you can scaffold assessment design from smaller, narrower focus to increasingly broader focus where the students can engage with wider and more complex concepts. And I've got to mention clarity of instructions. Often when it comes to assessment design, that is the weak point, that the instructions that students get, that they can't understand the instructions or the instructions doesn't quite get them into the right space. And that's because often we as educators will write these instructions. We know what it is, we understand what it is, but we don't think about it from a student's perspective on how they might understand it. So once you get assignments that just don't make much sense or they consistently get something wrong, it's probably not them that got it wrong, it's probably you that got it wrong when it comes to instructions. If you see that coming through, that's a red flag for us. And equity, access and inclusion is something that's an increasing attention within the world literature, and it's particularly around supporting students that have greater needs. And the idea here is that we have equitable practices in order to achieve equal outcomes. That's a goal that we aim for. Ethical and legal compliance. I've talked about this a little bit already, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But what's important here is that we manage risk. And there's definitely risk within work integrated learning because they're in the workplace, they are doing real things, and it has real consequences as well. In addition to that, we as an institution have a responsibility of the student in the workplace because they are there also for university purpose. So there are some risk requirements that we need to, and again, we'll talk more about that later on, but there are some requirements around the risk to make sure that we are managing that appropriately. And lastly, external engagement. Our hosts, they are fundamentally important for our programs. If we don't have our hosts, if we don't have our employers, we don't have our program. So it's really important that we have a good structure in place to do external engagement and to have that as a relationship building rather than a transactional type of an activity. Now, again, you're in a very fortunate position that your students are already in the workplace, so you've already done that first difficult step about sourcing opportunities, but for other programs that's more challenging. And often it's seen for programs where students go into the workplace and come back again, that the workplace is doing the university a favor. Because for them, having a new person in the workplace, it's work, they need to supervise it, cost them money, they're probably not really productive until the end of the placement, and just as they start becoming productive, they go back to university again. So we need to be very mindful that we are not transactional in our nature.